In November 1970, a crew of 12 miners descended into the depths of the Copper Ridge mine in rural Montana for what should have been a routine shift in one of the state's most productive copper operations. When the next shift arrived 8 hours later, they found the mine shaft empty, equipment abandoned, and no trace of the missing crew. Despite extensive rescue efforts involving hundreds of volunteers and federal mining safety officials, not a single miner was ever found. No bodies, no equipment, no explanation. For 54 years, the disappearance of the Copper Ridge 12 remained one of Montana's most baffling industrial mysteries. Then, in 2024, when the abandoned mine was being evaluated for environmental cleanup and potential historic preservation, geological survey teams made a discovery deep in the mountain that would finally reveal what happened during that November night in 1970 and expose a cover-up that reached the highest levels of corporate and government power. Detective Robert Bob Sullivan had been with the Montana State Police for 26 years, but the Copper Ridge case was before his time. He'd heard the story, of course. Every law enforcement officer in Montana knew about the 12 miners who had simply vanished from one of the state's deepest mines. The case had become part of local folklore, discussed in bars and coffee shops throughout the mining communities of western Montana, a reminder of the dangers that lurked beneath the surface of the earth. Sullivan had grown up in Butte, Montana's most famous mining town, where stories of underground accidents and disappeared workers were part of everyday conversation. His own grandfather had worked the copper mines until a cave-in in 1962 had left him permanently disabled. Sullivan understood the culture of mining communities, where dangerous work was accepted as part of life, but where the disappearance of 12 experienced miners without a trace was something that defied explanation. Now, Sullivan stood in the evidence room at State Police Headquarters in Helena, holding a file folder that had grown thick with reports, witness statements, and investigative documents accumulated over more than 5 decades. The folder had been largely inactive since the mid-1970s, when the original investigation had been officially suspended due to lack of evidence and viable leads. The case had haunted several generations of investigators. Detective William Hayes, who had been the original lead investigator in 1970, had worked the case until his retirement in 1985, never finding a satisfactory explanation for what had happened to the missing miners. Hayes had died in 2003, taking with him a lifetime of suspicions and theories about corporate cover-ups and government interference that he had never been able to prove. The call that had reactivated the Copper Ridge investigation had come from Dr. Janet Mitchell, a geologist with the Environmental Protection Agency who was conducting a comprehensive survey of abandoned mining sites throughout Montana. The EPA was required to assess environmental contamination at hundreds of old mines before determining which sites needed immediate cleanup and which could be safely sealed or converted to other uses. Dr. Mitchell was part of a new generation of environmental scientists who had grown up hearing stories about the Copper Ridge disappearance. As a geology student at the University of Montana in the 1990s, she had written her senior thesis on mining accidents in the state's history, with a chapter dedicated to the unsolved mystery of the missing miners. "What exactly did your survey team discover?" Sullivan asked Dr. Mitchell, who had driven from the mine site to personally brief him on their findings rather than filing a routine report. Dr. Mitchell spread a collection of photographs and geological survey maps across Sullivan's desk. The images showed sophisticated scanning equipment being used in the dark tunnels of the abandoned mine, along with computer-generated diagrams that revealed the internal structure of the mountain in unprecedented detail. "We were using ground-penetrating radar and core sampling to assess the structural integrity of the old mine shafts," she explained. "The Copper Ridge mine has been sealed since 1971, but we needed to determine if there were any environmental hazards that required remediation before the site could be considered for historic preservation." Sullivan studied the photographs, which showed various pieces of vintage mining equipment still in place after more than 50 years, covered in dust and mineral deposits, but remarkably well preserved in the controlled environment of the sealed mine. Did you find contamination? We found something more significant than contamination, Doctor, Mitchell replied, pulling out a series of more detailed images. About 800 feet down the main shaft, in a section that was supposedly never fully excavated according to the original mine blueprints, we discovered a sealed chamber that doesn't appear on any of the official mine documentation. The photographs showed what appeared to be a deliberately constructed concrete barrier blocking access to a section of the mine tunnel. The barrier was substantial, several feet thick, and professionally constructed with steel reinforcement. Most importantly, it had been built from the inside of the tunnel, suggesting that someone had wanted to seal off whatever was behind it permanently. We used specialized sonar equipment to examine the area beyond the barrier, Doctor, Mitchell continued, her voice dropping as she reached the most disturbing part of her report. Detective, there are human remains in that sealed chamber. Multiple individuals, along with mining equipment and personal effects that appeared to date from 1970. Sullivan felt the familiar tingle of a cold case suddenly developing new life. 12 miners who had vanished without a trace in 1970. A sealed chamber discovered 54 years later containing human remains and evidence that had been deliberately hidden. Someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to conceal what had happened to the Copper Ridge 12. The implications were staggering. If Dr. Mitchell's findings were accurate, the 12 missing miners hadn't disappeared in an accident or even been killed in a sudden catastrophe. They had been deliberately sealed inside the mine, turned into living tombs for reasons that someone had considered important enough to commit mass murder. Sullivan immediately contacted his supervisor, Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Reynolds, to brief her on the development and request authorization for a full criminal investigation. The Copper Ridge case had generated significant public interest over the decades, and any major developments would need to be handled carefully to preserve the integrity of the investigation while managing media attention and community expectations. I want a complete forensic team on site within 24 hours, Reynolds told Sullivan after reviewing Dr. Mitchell's preliminary findings. This could be the biggest break we've had on this case in over 50 years, but it's also going to reopen a lot of old wounds in the mining communities. We need to be prepared for significant public and media attention. The drive from Helena to the Copper Ridge mine site took Sullivan through some of Montana's most rugged and historically significant landscape. He followed Highway 2 west through the Cabinet Mountains, passing through small communities that had been built around mining operations and timber extraction, many of which had struggled economically since the decline of both industries in the 1980s and 1990s. The route took him through Libby, Montana, a town that had its own tragic history with mining-related health problems due to asbestos contamination from the nearby vermiculite mine. The parallels between Libby's ongoing struggle with corporate cover-ups and health problems and the mystery of Copper Ridge were not lost on Sullivan as he drove through the community. As he drove, Sullivan reviewed what he knew about the original investigation from the case files he had studied in preparation for visiting the mine site. The Copper Ridge mine had been one of Montana's most productive and supposedly safest mining operations during its peak years from 1955 to 1970. The facility had employed over 200 workers at its height and had been considered a model for modern mining practices. The mine consisted of multiple shaft levels extending more than 1,000 feet into the Cabinet Mountains, connected by a complex network of tunnels, transport systems, and support facilities. The operation had been owned and operated by Anaconda Mining Corporation, one of the largest mining companies in the western United States, with operations throughout Montana, Idaho, and Nevada. Anaconda had invested heavily in safety equipment and procedures at Copper Ridge, partly due to federal regulations, but also because the company's executives understood that accidents were expensive and bad for public relations. The mine had an excellent safety record prior to November 1970, with only minor injuries and no fatalities during its 15 years of operation. The 12 miners who had vanished on November 15, 1970, represented a typical crew for the overnight shift at Copper Ridge. They included experienced veterans of the mining industry, skilled equipment operators, and support personnel who were responsible for maintaining the complex systems that kept the deep mine operational and safe. Jack Morrison, the crew supervisor, had been 43 years old and had worked at Copper Ridge for over 15 years, starting as a general laborer and working his way up to shift supervisor through a combination of experience, reliability, and natural leadership abilities. Morrison was known throughout the mining community as someone who never compromised on safety procedures and who had an encyclopedic knowledge of the Copper Ridge tunnel system. The other 11 miners included Frank Rodriguez, age 34, an equipment operator who had worked at several mines throughout Montana before joining Copper Ridge in 1967. William Bill Thompson, age 28, a tunneling specialist who had recently been promoted to senior equipment operator. James Park, age 57, the oldest member of the crew and a safety inspector with over 30 years of mining experience, and 8 other experienced workers ranging in age from 22 to 49. All 12 men were residents of the small communities surrounding the mine, including Libby, Troy, and Yak. They were family men with wives and children, active members of their communities, and experienced professionals who understood both the dangers and the rewards of underground mining work. According to the original investigation records, the 12-man crew had reported for their shift at 10 p.m. on November 14, 1970, following standard procedures for the overnight shift. They had been assigned to work in the deepest section of the mine, approximately 1,000 feet below the surface, extracting ore from a newly opened vein that had shown exceptional copper content in preliminary testing. The work assignment was routine for an experienced crew like Morrison's team. They were responsible for operating the heavy equipment used to extract ore from the rock face, loading the extracted material onto conveyor systems that transported it to the surface, and maintaining the support systems that kept the deep tunnels safe and operational. The crew had checked in with surface supervisors at regular intervals throughout the night, using the mine's communication system to report on their progress and confirm that all safety protocols were being followed. The communication logs from that night showed normal operations, with the crew reporting steady progress on their assigned tasks and no indications of problems or unusual conditions. Their final communication had been at 5:30 a.m. on November 15th, when Morrison had radioed to surface control that they were finishing their work for the shift and beginning the process of securing equipment before returning to the surface. The communication had been routine, with Morrison reporting that all equipment was functioning normally and that the crew would be ready to hand off operations to the incoming day shift. When the day shift crew arrived at 6 a.m. to begin their work, they had followed standard procedures by taking the elevator down to the work areas to meet with the overnight crew for the shift handoff. Instead of finding Morrison's team preparing to leave, they had discovered empty work areas with all equipment still running, but no workers anywhere to be found. The day shift supervisor, Robert Chen, had immediately attempted to contact the missing crew using the mine's communication system, but had received no response. Chen had then conducted a thorough search of the immediate work area, thinking that the overnight crew might have been delayed by equipment problems or might have moved to a different section of the mine to address maintenance issues. When the search of the immediate area revealed no sign of the missing workers, Chen had followed emergency procedures by notifying surface control and requesting additional personnel to conduct a comprehensive search of the mine. Within 30 minutes, every available worker at the Copper Ridge facility was involved in the search effort. The initial search had been systematic and thorough, with teams checking every accessible tunnel, work area, and storage facility in the mine. The searchers had used the mine's communication system to coordinate their efforts and had followed established protocols for emergency situations underground. By 8 a.m., when 2 hours of searching had failed to locate any sign of the missing crew, Anaconda Mining Corporation had contacted local law enforcement and federal mining safety officials to report the disappearance and request assistance with the search effort. The original search effort had been massive and professional, involving not only Anaconda personnel, but also federal mine safety inspectors, local law enforcement officers, volunteer rescue teams, and mining experts from throughout the region. The search had continued for over 2 weeks, with teams working around the clock to examine every possible location where the missing miners might have been trapped or killed. Federal investigators had brought in specialized equipment to test for toxic gases, structural collapses, equipment malfunctions, and any other hazards that might have caused the disappearance of 12 experienced workers. The mine's ventilation systems, communication equipment, and safety protocols had all been examined and found to be functioning normally. Despite the extensive search effort, no trace of the missing miners had ever been discovered. No bodies, no personal effects, no equipment, no evidence of an accident or emergency. The 12 men had simply vanished as if they had never existed, leaving behind only their families' grief and a mystery that had haunted the mining community for over 5 decades. Now, as Sullivan approached the entrance to the abandoned Copper Ridge mine, he felt the weight of expectation from the families who had never received answers about their loved ones, the investigators who had spent careers trying to solve the case, and the mining communities that had never understood how 12 experienced workers could disappear without a trace. Dr. Mitchell met Sullivan at the mine entrance, which had been sealed with concrete and steel barriers in 1971, shortly after the disappearance investigation had been officially suspended. The EPA survey team had obtained special federal permits to reopen access to the mine for their environmental assessment, but only a limited section of the original facility was accessible to investigators. The area where we discovered the sealed chamber is about 800 feet down the main shaft, Dr. Mitchell explained, as they prepared to descend into the mine using modern safety equipment and emergency communication systems. The chamber itself appears to have been excavated sometime in the late 1960s, but it was never included in any official mine plans or safety documentation that we've been able to locate. The descent into the Copper Ridge mine was like traveling back in time 54 years. The main shaft had been preserved exactly as it was in 1970, with vintage mining equipment, safety signs from the era, and even workers' personal items still scattered throughout the tunnels where they had been left during the original search efforts. Emergency lighting powered by portable generators illuminated the path down the main shaft, casting eerie shadows on the rock walls and revealing the impressive engineering that had been required to create a safe working environment so far beneath the Earth's surface. The air in the mine was cold and still, with the distinctive smell of mineral deposits and the dampness that characterized underground environments. 800 feet below the surface, Sullivan could see the concrete barrier that Dr. Mitchell's team had discovered during their environmental survey. The structure was immediately recognizable as professional construction work, clearly the product of experienced contractors who had access to substantial resources and specialized equipment. The barrier completely blocked a section of tunnel that extended into the mountain beyond the main mining area. According to the original mine blueprints, this section should not have existed at all, suggesting that it had been excavated secretly and never included in official documentation. How did your team determine there were human remains behind this barrier? Sullivan asked, examining the concrete structure and trying to understand how it had been constructed and concealed. Dr. Mitchell pointed to sophisticated scanning equipment that her team had positioned near the concrete wall. Ground-penetrating radar can detect density variations in rock and soil that indicate the presence of organic materials, metal objects, and areas where the earth has been disturbed. Behind this barrier, we found multiple areas of disturbed earth consistent with burial sites, along with metallic objects that appeared to be mining equipment and personal items. The implications were chilling and obvious. The 12 missing miners hadn't vanished from the mine. They had been sealed inside it, along with their equipment and any evidence of what had actually happened to them. Someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to ensure that their bodies and the truth about their fate would never be discovered. Sullivan immediately authorized the mobilization of a specialized forensic team to safely breach the concrete barrier and examine the sealed chamber. The operation would be complex and dangerous, requiring experts in both mining safety and forensic investigation to work together in the challenging underground environment while preserving any evidence that might have survived for over 50 years. The forensic excavation team included specialists from the FBI's Evidence Response Team, mining safety engineers from the Federal Mine Safety and Health Administration, forensic anthropologists experienced in working in confined spaces, and technical specialists with the equipment necessary to safely breach concrete barriers in underground environments. While the forensic team prepared for the excavation, Sullivan continued his review of the original case files, looking for any details that might have been overlooked during the initial investigation or any leads that could help explain why the miners had been sealed in the underground chamber. The 1970 investigation had been led by Detective William Hayes of the Lincoln County Sheriff's Department, working in cooperation with federal mining safety officials and corporate investigators from Anaconda Mining Corporation. Hayes had been a veteran law enforcement officer with experience in mining-related cases, but the Copper Ridge disappearance had been unlike anything he had encountered in his career. Hayes' investigation notes, preserved in the case files, revealed his growing frustration with what he perceived as lack of cooperation from Anaconda Mining Corporation and interference from federal officials who seemed more interested in protecting corporate interests than in finding the missing miners. In a report dated December 15, 1970, Hayes had written, "Corporate officials continue to insist that there is no possibility the missing workers could be trapped anywhere in the mine, claiming that every accessible area has been thoroughly searched. However, Anaconda has denied access to several sections of the mine, claiming that these areas are unsafe for search teams. Federal officials have supported these restrictions, citing mining safety regulations." Hayes had also noted inconsistencies in the corporate executives' accounts of the mine's layout and operations. Anaconda officials have provided conflicting information about the extent of excavation in the deepest sections of the mine. Some executives claim that certain areas were never fully developed, while others insist that all excavation work was completed according to original plans. These discrepancies suggest that there may be sections of the mine that are not included in official documentation. Most significantly, Hayes had documented his suspicions about the timing of the disappearance and its relationship to other activities at the mine. The missing crew was working in a section of the mine that had been off-limits to most workers until November 1970. This area had been designated for special projects by corporate management, with access restricted to selected personnel. The nature of these special projects has not been disclosed to investigators. Hayes had attempted to interview Anaconda executives about the special projects, but had been told that the information was proprietary and could not be disclosed without authorization from corporate headquarters and federal officials. When Hayes had requested such authorization, he had been told that the special projects were not relevant to the disappearance investigation. The detective's frustration with the lack of cooperation was evident in his final report on the case, filed in February 1971. This investigation has been hampered by restrictions imposed by corporate and federal officials who appear more concerned with protecting business interests than with finding 12 missing workers. Without access to all areas of the mine and full disclosure of all activities conducted at the facility, it is impossible to determine what happened to the missing crew. Hayes had recommended that the investigation remain open, pending full cooperation from Anaconda Mining Corporation and federal officials, but his recommendations had been overruled by his superiors, who had been pressured to close the case due to lack of evidence and viable leads. Now, 54 years later, Sullivan was preparing to investigate the same areas of the mine that Hayes had been denied access to, potentially uncovering evidence that had been deliberately concealed from the original investigation. The forensic excavation of the sealed chamber began on a cold Monday morning in March 2024 with Sullivan and Doctor Mitchell observing the careful process of breaching the concrete barrier while preserving any evidence that might be found on the other side. The barrier was several feet thick and reinforced with steel rebar, requiring specialized concrete cutting equipment that could operate safely in the confined underground environment. The cutting process had to be conducted slowly and carefully to avoid creating sparks that could ignite any potentially flammable gases that might have accumulated behind the barrier over the decades. As the cutting equipment gradually created an opening in the concrete wall, the forensic team used atmospheric monitoring equipment to test the air quality in the sealed chamber and ensure that it was safe for investigators to enter. When the barrier was finally breached, creating an opening large enough for investigators to enter the sealed chamber, what they found exceeded Sullivan's worst expectations about the fate of the missing miners. The sealed chamber was larger than the radar imaging had suggested, extending deep into the mountain beyond the main mining area. The space appeared to have been excavated specifically to serve as a holding area or work site for activities that were separate from the main copper mining operation. Most significantly, the chamber contained the remains of 12 individuals positioned throughout the space in ways that suggested they had been alive when they were sealed inside and had survived for some time before dying from asphyxiation or dehydration. Dr. Patricia Coleman, the forensic anthropologist leading the examination of the remains, briefed Sullivan on the preliminary findings. Based on the condition and positioning of the remains, these individuals were definitely alive when they were sealed into this chamber, she said grimly. They survived for an extended period, possibly days or even weeks, before dying from the lack of adequate air, water, and food. The evidence found in the sealed chamber painted a horrifying picture of the miners' final days. They had attempted to break through the concrete barrier using their mining tools, leaving deep gouges and scratches in the surface that showed their desperate efforts to escape. They had carefully rationed their limited supplies of food and water, dividing resources among the group to extend their survival as long as possible. Personal belongings found with the remains confirmed the identity of the missing miners. Jack Morrison's supervisor badge, Frank Rodriguez's distinctive belt buckle, James Park's safety inspector credentials, and other personal items that had been described by family members during the original investigation. Most heartbreaking were the personal messages that the miners had carved into the rock walls of the chamber before they died. Final letters to their families, expressions of love and regret, and desperate pleas for help that had gone unheard for over 50 years. Jack Morrison, using his knowledge and leadership skills, even in the face of death, had carved a detailed account of what had happened to them into the stone wall of the chamber. The message, preserved exactly as Morrison had written it 54 years earlier, revealed the truth about the Copper Ridge disappearance. The message read, November 15th, 1970. We discovered something in the deep tunnels that we weren't supposed to see. Uranium deposits, rich veins, more than any of us had ever seen. Company officials and government men came down and told us we had to stay quiet about what we found, said it was classified, said we could go to prison if we talked about it. When we refused to sign papers saying we hadn't seen anything, they sealed us in here. They said it was temporary, that they just needed time to figure out what to do about the situation. But they're not coming back for us. Tell our families we tried to get home. Tell them we died trying to do the right thing. Morrison's message continued with specific details about what the crew had discovered in the deep sections of the mine and the corporate and government response to their discovery. According to his account, the miners had accidentally broken through into a natural cavern system while working on their assigned copper extraction tasks. Instead of copper ore, they had found rich uranium deposits that appeared to have been secretly mined by Anaconda for an extended period. Found evidence they've been mining uranium here for years, Morrison had carved into the wall. Secret operation, no safety protocols, no proper permits. Workers who found out about it before us disappeared or were transferred to other locations. Company and government treating it like national security matter, but really it's about money and avoiding prosecution for illegal mining. The discovery of significant uranium deposits in the Copper Ridge mine would have been extraordinarily valuable in 1970, when uranium was in high demand for nuclear weapons and power generation during the height of the Cold War. However, uranium mining was strictly regulated by federal authorities, and unauthorized extraction could result in criminal prosecution of company executives and federal oversight officials. The miners' refusal to remain silent about their discovery had apparently led to a decision by corporate and government officials to eliminate them permanently rather than risk exposure of the illegal uranium mining operation. The 12 men had been sealed alive in the underground chamber and left to die. Their families told that they had simply vanished in an unexplained industrial accident. Sullivan worked with federal authorities to investigate the corporate and government officials who had been responsible for the murders. The investigation revealed a conspiracy involving Anaconda Mining Corporation executives, federal officials responsible for uranium oversight, and private contractors who had carried out the actual sealing of the underground chamber. Corporate records from Anaconda Mining Corporation, many of which had been classified under national security provisions for decades, showed that company executives had been aware of uranium deposits in the Copper Ridge mine as early as 1967. They had been conducting secret uranium extraction operations in the deepest sections of the mine while maintaining normal copper mining operations as cover for their illegal activities. The unauthorized uranium mining had been extremely profitable for Anaconda, generating millions of dollars in revenue that was not reported to federal authorities or included in the company's official financial statements. The illegal operation had also allowed the company to avoid the extensive safety and environmental regulations that applied to authorized uranium mining operations. When the overnight crew had accidentally discovered evidence of the illegal uranium mining, they had threatened the entire conspiracy. Not only could their testimony have led to criminal prosecution of company executives, but it could have exposed federal officials who had been complicit in the unauthorized mining operation. Rather than face exposure and prosecution, Anaconda executives had worked with their federal contacts to arrange for the elimination of the witnesses. The decision to seal the miners alive in the underground chamber had been made at the highest levels of the company and had involved federal officials who were supposed to be overseeing mining safety and environmental compliance. The investigation revealed that the concrete barrier had been constructed by Morrison Engineering, a private contractor with experience in military and government construction projects. The company had specialized in building secure facilities for sensitive government operations and had the expertise and equipment necessary to seal the underground chamber quickly and professionally. Morrison Engineering's archived records showed that they had been contracted to perform emergency mine safety work at Copper Ridge in November 1970. The contract had been classified under national security provisions, and the details of their work had been sealed to prevent disclosure of what they had actually done at the mine. The federal officials involved in the conspiracy had used their authority over uranium mining regulation to classify the entire operation and prevent any investigation that might have exposed the illegal activities. They had also used their influence with local law enforcement to limit the scope of the missing persons investigation and prevent Detective Hayes from accessing the areas of the mine where evidence of the murders was hidden. The investigation identified several specific individuals who had been directly involved in the conspiracy, though most had died by 2024. However, 3 former Anaconda executives and 2 retired federal officials were still alive and could be prosecuted for their roles in the murders. Federal prosecutors filed charges against the 5 surviving conspirators for conspiracy to commit murder, violations of civil rights under color of law, and racketeering in connection with the illegal uranium mining operation. The charges carried potential sentences of life imprisonment and represented one of the largest corporate murder cases in U.S. history. The trial of the surviving conspirators began in federal court in Montana in September 2024 and attracted national media attention. The evidence recovered from the sealed chamber, combined with corporate documents and government records that had been declassified for the trial, provided a comprehensive picture of how the conspiracy had been planned and executed. Testimony from mining experts and federal investigators revealed the scope of the illegal uranium operation and the lengths that the conspirators had gone to conceal their activities. The uranium extracted from Copper Ridge had been sold to government contractors and private companies for use in nuclear weapons and power generation, generating substantial profits for Anaconda while avoiding the safety and environmental oversight required for legal uranium mining. The families of the Copper Ridge 12 testified about the impact of their loved one's disappearance and the decades of uncertainty they had endured while the truth remained hidden. Their testimony provided powerful evidence of the human cost of the conspiracy and the suffering that had been caused by the decision to murder 12 innocent workers. Janet Morrison, Jack Morrison's daughter, testified about growing up without her father and the impact his disappearance had had on her family. "For 54 years, we didn't know if Dad was dead or alive," she said during her testimony. "We didn't know if he had abandoned us, if he had been killed in an accident, or if he was suffering somewhere and needed our help. The not knowing was almost worse than learning the truth about how he died." The trial revealed the full scope of the conspiracy and resulted in convictions for all 5 defendants. 3 former Anaconda executives received life sentences without the possibility of parole, while 2 retired federal officials received sentences of 40 years each in federal prison. The convictions represented a landmark victory for corporate accountability and demonstrated that powerful individuals could be held responsible for their crimes regardless of how much time had passed or how well they had concealed their activities. The case also led to significant reforms in mining safety oversight, corporate accountability, and government transparency in natural resource extraction. Congressional investigations revealed systematic problems with federal oversight of mining operations and led to new legislation strengthening worker protection and environmental compliance. The Copper Ridge mine site was converted into a memorial and educational center dedicated to mining safety and worker rights. The underground chamber where the 12 miners had been sealed was preserved as part of the memorial, allowing visitors to understand the conditions the miners had faced during their final days. The memorial included exhibits about the history of mining in Montana, the importance of worker safety, and the dangers of corporate and government corruption. It became an important educational resource for mining communities throughout the western United States and a symbol of the ongoing struggle for worker rights and corporate accountability. Sullivan retired from the Montana State Police in 2025, ending his career with the satisfaction of having finally solved one of the state's most enduring mysteries. The Copper Ridge case had demonstrated the importance of persistent investigation and the possibility that even decades-old crimes could be solved with new technology and changing political circumstances that allowed previously classified information to be revealed. The mountain that had been the tomb of the Copper Ridge 12 had finally given up its secrets, and their voices had finally been heard after more than half a century of silence. Their story became a reminder that some truths are too important to remain buried, no matter how powerful the interests trying to conceal them.